Phil Evans.
Ellie Ray Johnson.
Dick Brady.
Melinda Freeman, Director of Health and Human Services.
Deanne Betko, Deputy Director of Health and Human Services.
Forrest Dunbar.
And in the audience?
Michael Terry, Health and Human Services.
Barbara Jones, Municipal Clerk.
And Mr. Falsey is joining us. And Mr. Flynn, you're online?
I sure am.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Okay, Mr. Sweeney?
Mr. Falsey, as we begin this, would you tell us why we've been doing this? Understand the basis of this is a court decision that caused us to take a look at this. Is that correct? And that helps us to identify how we got here and where we're going.
Through the chair, that is correct. For a very long time, with the origin of Title 17 put in place, we have always interpreted our animal control ordinances to be strict liability offenses, much like traffic violations. If a police officer pulls you over for driving 60 in a 55-mile-per-hour speed zone, the police officer does not need to show that you were negligently speeding, just that you were speeding. That's all the way our animal control offenses have worked as well. A few years ago, the Alaska Court of Appeals reviewing a ordinance out of Dillingham, I think it may have been, issued a decision that said that where a title includes some volitional language or is ambiguous as to whether or not it creates strict liability offenses, more often than not you're going to read in a negligence standard. There are now 2 Superior Court cases in which that was wielded against the municipality to find that our animal control citations were invalidated. One was a dog bite case, in which a dog unambiguously did bite another person. It was cited for that, but the citation was overturned on appeal because the court said we could not show that the dog bite was a result of the owner's negligence. The other was a loose animal violation, which again was overturned on appeal because the owner was able to show we did not prove that the animal had become loose as a result of the owner's negligence. If we live under the new apparent state of play put upon us by the court system, it radically changed the way animal control citations will have to be defended, because in addition to now saying the dog bite occurred, the animal was loose, we'll also have to do some kind of prophylactic investigation to show how those things came about. And we'll almost certainly be drawn into protracted discussions with the hearing officer and potentially the Superior Court as to exactly why and how that dog bite came to occur or how the animal got loose. We don't think that's the way the animal control code has ever been intended to work or should properly work, and so that's why we brought the corrective ordinance before the Assembly.
And the administration, I think it was a 4-page message they sent to the Animal Control Advisory Board as to why they should approve this settlement. It was about 4 pages signed by the mayor. So this wasn't something that just came out of animal control. This was done out of the mayor's office. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Please present.
Thank you. We've asked Deanne Betko, our Deputy Director, to present further information and a bit of history as well. She has overseen the animal care and control facility for many years now as the contract manager, so she's extremely well educated and considered an expert for DHHS in this arena. So Deanne, thank you for your preparation.
So I think Mr. Halsey very well explained where we are. I have multiple examples of where this is creating problems in current cases where animal owners either have their dog jump a fence and they didn't know their fence wouldn't keep the dog confined, or they had their dog on a carabiner and weren't home when the dog got loose and it went out and attacked another dog. These kinds of cases are happening quite regularly, and the way that the code is being interpreted now is animal control's hands are really tied in terms of enforcing public safety. We don't really get much complaint from the public that animal control is doing too much. The public is very concerned that they're not doing enough when it comes to these public safety cases. I think it's important to note too some of the things that won't change with this ordinance, and that would be that animal control still would carry the burden of proof in all of their cases. These offenses remain civil citations. They're not associated with any kind of imprisonment. Officers will continue to have discretion in the way that they enforce the code. If there are special circumstances, they can certainly do education, they can do warnings and that type of thing if the situation warrants it. And of course, animal owners will retain the right to have due process. They can request a hearing on the matter and or go to court with the matter. Any questions?
maybe it's out of, the biggest common thing I run into is dogs barking, and we have to record them for 20 minutes nonstop. And is that this, or is that noise ordinance?
That is part of Title 17. The chronic animal noise is what it's referring to, and the 20 minutes is allowed for facilities, licensed facilities. Otherwise, in general, folks have 5 minutes of barking allowed.
Is that in here at all? Or?
It is in Title 17, and the strict liability change would apply to all of Title 17.
Mr. Dunbar?
I'm not sure if this is the appropriate time to discuss it, but I know there was an amendment proposed by Assemblyman Croft to this, I believe, and could we get a position from the administration on that amendment?
Thank you. As a matter of fact, I think that Mr. Falsey may be the one that
I
dropped
asked
it.
the question, Mr. Falsey, Mr. Falsey can respond to it, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Training.
I don't know through the chair whether that amendment is in hard copy in front of anyone, but if not, I can summarize it. I believe Assemblymember Croft intends to introduce an amendment that would add to the definition of a secure enclosure a new standard at the end, and that would read that the owner or custodian of an animal may establish by clear and convincing evidence that a structure was a secure enclosure despite failing to prevent the release of an animal, because the animal's release was primarily caused by a factor not attributable to the character of the closure or to an actual mission of the owner or custodian of an animal. In talking with Assemblymember Croft, I think his notion was that if we remove the word reasonably prevent, there should still be some escape valve for the owner or custodian of an animal to take on the burden of saying my animal did become loose, but it was not because the enclosure suffered from some known defect or because of some failing or act of my own, but because of some third-party factor for which I should not be held liable. So an example in the amendment being, say we have an earthquake, a tree falls down, knocks down part of your fence, and then the animal gets loose. They would then say, well, clear and convincing evidence, and this was not my fault. We're sort of tinkering on the margins with that amendment. I think all things being equal, we prefer the clean version that we proposed, but I think we could live with the standard that Assemblymember Croft would like consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey. Mr. Dunbar?
So just to be clear, so I understand it right, and I remember reading through it, but fortunately my mind is a little foggy right now from all the cold medicine. So they'd still be strictly liable. This would be an affirmative defense. Is that right?
That was the notion, through the chair, that was the notion, that there would be a strict liability offense, but they could reflect that liability by establishing through clear and convincing evidence this external cause.
But is it the administration's position this is sufficient? This would be, you think this would be sufficiently used sufficiently seldomly that it wouldn't sort of obviate the purpose of the change?
Through the chair, I think the answer to that is yes, and at the very least, it would get us out of the question that we are, the morass that we are currently in, where courts are imputing a negligence standard into the title more broadly. We can still say that this is the way the title is to be construed, this would just be relief.
Thank you, Mr. Falsey. Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, are we strictly talking about, an earthquake, we're talking about an act of God, so is that phrase something that we should put in there instead of a long-term explanation? And do we have a definition in the code as to what an act of God is considered?
Through the chair, we could do that as an alternative. I think that may be a little more narrow, because here, I suppose you could also use this language to say a vandal showed up at my house and a security camera shows someone cut my fence with a plant lopper or something, which would not necessarily be an act of God. If you want to go that way, I think that term does have some meaning in the law, so that in a lot of places you probably could just use it as is.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Falsey. Mr. Training?
Since Eric's in Italy right now, who's bringing this amendment forward? Forrest, have you agreed to bring it forward? I'm trying to figure out who's going to bring it forward.
He emailed it.
To all of us?
Doesn't that mean it's already been submitted?
No.
Oh, I'm not bringing it forward.
Okay, well, that's,
Just to get it out there.
okay, well,
If you want
All right.
amendments, you should not be in Italy.
Well,
Here.
if he can, I mean, if he asked me to, I might be willing to, or someone else. I have no strong feelings on that.
It's a big country.
thank you, Mr. Dunbar, and anyway, please continue. Is there any, are you done? Oh my goodness, this is really quick.
It's pretty straightforward.
Okay, so in terms of, since Mr. Training brought it up, everybody saw Mr. Croft's proposed amendment, but, you know, if nobody brings it forward, then that's not being brought forward. Anyway, any other comments or questions?
Well,
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wouldn't have a problem bringing that amendment forward because sometimes there are things that happen that are beyond your control. The neighborhood kids come over to play with your dog and you're not there, the dog gets out. You know, it could be something as simple as that, you know. So I think sometimes life happens and making someone liable when they're not home and typically the dog has always been, or the animal's always been secured in the past. I understand where Mr. Clough is coming from with that.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Dunbar?
No, ma'am.
Okay, well, my comment is, Mr. Peterson, if you'd like to bring it forward on Tuesday, when we get to the document to debate. Any other comments before we move on? No? Okay, work session adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for being here.